Pete Hegseth has just set off a political firestorm, and it's all centered on one of the most sacred pieces of ground in America, Arlington National Cemetery. In a stunning announcement, Hegseth revealed he wants to bring back the Confederate monument that the Pentagon ordered removed just last year. To some, this is a bold stand for preserving history. To others, it's a blatant attempt to glorify a past built on slavery and division. And as the outrage grows, this battle is no longer just about a monument. It's about the power to shape how America tells its own story. The Confederate monument at Arlington wasn't just another piece of stone. It was a towering bronze and granite memorial, unveiled in 1914, that stood as a tribute to soldiers who fought against the United States during the Civil War. Commissioned during the Jim Crow era, its design featured Confederate leaders, allegorical figures, and even depictions romanticizing slavery. For more than a century, it stood in Section 16 of the cemetery, a place where Union and Confederate dead were buried side by side. Supporters argued that it symbolized reconciliation after a brutal conflict, a gesture meant to heal the nation's wounds. But critics saw something very different. A monument born in a time when segregation was law and white supremacy was openly celebrated, a time when the narrative of the lost cause was being cemented in American culture. In late 2023, after years of debate, the Pentagon ordered its removal as part of a broader initiative to strip military bases and federal properties of Confederate symbols. Crews dismantled it quietly, but not without controversy. For many, its removal marked progress. For others, it was an act of cultural erasure. And now, thanks to Pete Hegseth's announcement, the fight over that monument is back with a vengeance. When Pete Hegseth took the podium, there was no hedging, no careful political language. He said plainly that if he has any say in the matter, the Confederate monument will return to Arlington National Cemetery. Hegseth, a Fox News personality, Army veteran, and vocal conservative commentator, framed his mission as a defense of American heritage against what he calls the radical left's campaign to erase history. He painted the removal of the statue as part of a larger cultural battle, one that stretches from the tearing down of monuments to the rewriting of textbooks. "You cannot understand where we're going if you erase where we've been," he told the crowd, his voice rising with each sentence. To Hegseth, this isn't just about a memorial. It's about preserving a version of history that includes the full, unvarnished past, even the uncomfortable parts. But critics argue his stance isn't about the full past at all. They say it's about protecting symbols of rebellion against the United States, symbols created in an era designed to uphold segregation and racial hierarchy. For them, Hegseth's promise is a dangerous step backward, one that ignores why those symbols were erected in the first place. With those words, Hegseth drew a sharp battle line. And it's a line that's forcing Americans to once again choose sides in a war of memory and meaning. The decision to remove the Confederate monument from Arlington didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of years of heated national debate and a formal directive from the highest levels of the U.S. military. In 2022, Congress established the Naming Commission, a bipartisan panel tasked with identifying and recommending the removal of Confederate names, symbols, and tributes from all Department of Defense property. The Arlington Monument was one of their most contentious recommendations. The Pentagon agreed, citing the monument's origins in the Lost Cause movement, a decades-long effort to recast the Confederacy not as a rebellion to preserve slavery, but as a noble struggle for states' rights. Military leaders argued that symbols honoring that narrative had no place in an institution sworn to defend the United States, especially on sacred burial grounds where men and women who died for the Union rest just yards away. By late December 2023, contractors arrived quietly at the site. Under the cover of winter skies, they fenced off Section 16 and began dismantling the statue piece by piece. The process took days, and while some mourned its loss, others saw the removal as a long-overdue correction, a symbolic break from a false, romanticized version of American history. For many, it was the Pentagon drawing a clear line. In the military's eyes, the Confederacy was the enemy, and honoring it at Arlington was no longer acceptable. But now, with Pete Hegseth's vow to bring the monument back, that line is being challenged. This fight over a single monument is quickly becoming a litmus test in conservative politics. For Pete Hegseth, pushing for the statue's return isn't just about history. It's about signaling to the Republican base that he's willing to take on what many on the right see as woke overreach by the Pentagon and the federal government. Republican lawmakers, especially those aligned with the MAGA movement, have seized on the issue as a rallying cry. They argue that the military, once seen as one of the few institutions above partisan politics, has now been captured by progressive ideology. The removal of the monument is held up as proof, a visual reminder of what they believe is a broader purge of conservative values from American life. Democrats, meanwhile, see Hegseth's campaign as a calculated political stunt designed to inflame culture wars ahead of the next election cycle. To them, the idea of reinstating a monument honoring Confederate soldiers isn't just tone-deaf. It's an intentional provocation meant to energize a certain segment of voters by appealing to nostalgia for an era that excluded and oppressed millions of Americans. That's why this battle is now stretching far beyond Arlington's gates. It's being talked about in campaign rallies, political ads, and even presidential debates. And the stakes are clear. Whichever side controls the narrative about this monument may be able to sway voters on a much larger set of cultural and historical issues. When news broke that Pete Hegseth wanted the Confederate monument returned to Arlington National Cemetery, the public response was immediate and deeply divided. On one side, supporters flooded social media with messages praising Hegseth for standing up to the woke mob and defending what they see as an important part of America's military heritage. They argue that the monument isn't about glorifying slavery, but about honoring the dead and recognizing the shared sacrifices of soldiers on both sides of the Civil War. For them, the statue's return would symbolize respect for history, even its most painful chapters. On the other side, critics reacted with outrage, calling the push to reinstate the monument a slap in the face to Black Americans, Union veterans, and anyone who believes in confronting the real causes of the Civil War. Civil rights groups, historians, and some veterans organizations have spoken out forcefully, warning that putting the monument back would legitimize the lost cause narrative and undermine decades of efforts to present an honest accounting of the Confederacy's role in defending slavery. Protests have already been threatened if the plan moves forward. Editorial boards in major newspapers are weighing in, and advocacy groups are launching petitions to block any reversal of the Pentagon's decision. The clash isn't just ideological, it's deeply emotional. For many Americans, this is not an abstract policy debate. It's about who we choose to honor in our most sacred spaces and what story we're telling the next generation about who we are as a nation. Even if Pete Hegseth's push gains political momentum, actually bringing the monument back to Arlington National Cemetery would be anything but simple. First, there's the law. The monument's removal was part of a sweeping Pentagon directive, following the recommendations of the congressionally mandated Naming Commission, which spent months reviewing Confederate references across the U.S. military. Reversing that process wouldn't just require a new decision from the Department of Defense. It might require an act of Congress, especially given how thoroughly the existing law is tied to the removal effort. Then, there's the bureaucratic reality. The Pentagon operates under strict protocols for altering federal cemeteries, especially Arlington, which is both a military and national landmark. Approvals would need to pass through multiple agencies, from the Army to the Department of the Interior, and potentially face judicial review if advocacy groups file lawsuits. And even if the legal hurdles were cleared, there's the physical challenge. The statue wasn't just taken down, it was carefully dismantled, crated, and placed in storage. Reinstallation would require specialized crews, site preparation, and significant costs, potentially in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Given that Arlington's budget is already stretched, that funding would have to come from somewhere. likely sparking another public debate over whether taxpayers should foot the bill. In short, even with strong political backing, this wouldn't be a quick or quiet operation. Every step would be fought over, scrutinized, and possibly delayed by litigation. So what exactly is Pete Hegseth hoping to achieve with this campaign? Publicly, he frames it as a stand for historical preservation and a rejection of what he calls woke erasure of America's past. His messaging is designed to resonate with a conservative audience that's already frustrated by the removal of statues, the renaming of bases, and what they see as an aggressive rewriting of history. Privately, political analysts suspect there's a bigger play at work. By taking a hard stance on this issue, Hegseth isn't just defending a monument. He's bolstering his own profile as a cultural warrior, potentially paving the way for deeper political ambitions, whether that's a congressional run, a state-level office, or an even larger role in Republican politics. The next steps for this movement will likely involve rallying public support through petitions, targeted media coverage, and possible coordination with lawmakers who share his views. Some insiders believe a bill could be introduced in Congress to override the Pentagon's removal decision, though whether it could pass in today's political climate is a different question entirely. Hegseth has also hinted that even if he can't get the monument restored to Arlington, he'd push for it to be relocated to another prominent public space, ensuring it remains accessible and visible rather than locked away in storage. The big unknown is whether this issue will gain enough traction to survive beyond the current news cycle. Is this the start of a sustained political fight, or just another flashpoint in America's ongoing culture wars? At its core, the fight over the Confederate monument at Arlington isn't just about one statue. It's about how America chooses to remember itself. Monuments aren't neutral objects. They're deliberate statements about what a society values, honors, and wants to pass on to future generations. Supporters of restoring the statue argue that removing it erases history and sets a dangerous precedent, where the past is sanitized to fit modern political trends. They insist that preserving controversial symbols, even painful ones, allows the country to engage in honest dialogue about its full history, both the good and the bad. Opponents counter that monuments are not history itself, they're endorsements. And placing Confederate imagery in one of the nation's most sacred cemeteries sends a clear message about whose sacrifices we elevate. They argue that moving the monument is not erasing history, but rather aligning our public spaces with the democratic values the nation claims to uphold. This debate ties into a larger cultural battle over how America teaches history, what stories it elevates, and whose voices are centered. From school curricula to public art to museum exhibits, the same underlying question keeps resurfacing. Is the goal to preserve tradition as it was, or to reframe tradition in light of today's values? Whatever happens with this monument, the controversy is likely to echo in other debates over historical memory, from the names of military bases to the statues in town squares across the country. In that sense, Pete Hegseth's push is not just a political fight. It's part of an ongoing, unresolved national conversation about identity, heritage, and the meaning of patriotism in the 21st century. So here's the bottom line. Pete Hegseth's fight to restore the Confederate monument at Arlington isn't just about one piece of stone and bronze. It's about control over the narrative of American history, about who gets to decide what symbols stand in our most sacred spaces, and about the political leverage those battles can create. Whether you see this as defending heritage or glorifying a painful chapter of the past, one thing's certain. This story isn't over. Hegseth's not backing down, his supporters are mobilizing, and the cultural divide around history and identity is only getting sharper. The question now is, will this monument return to Arlington, find a new home elsewhere, or disappear into storage forever? And more importantly, what will that decision say about where America stands and where it's headed? Because in today's political climate, Sometimes the fiercest battles aren't fought in the halls of Congress. They're fought over the memories carved into stone. Stay tuned, because this fight is just getting started.